Greetings, Culture Warriors. It is I, Jeff Vieira, author of Culture is Everything, and your host for this latest dispatch from the front. Pitch another change-up to you today. No specific story referenced. Instead, I'm going to talk a little bit extemporaneously just about something that I've noticed and thought I would share with you, my beloved audience. I'm a great fan of Australian culture. I've never been over to Australia, but I was able, while I was spending some time stationed over in Japan and then on various trips to Asia, I was able to partake a little bit of Australian TV, particularly back in the mid-90s when I was stationed over there in the Air Force in Japan. And so when you wanted English language programming, Australia had a lot on offer, and through, I think it was the Star Network, if I remember correctly. I believe that was a Rupert Murdoch channel. I was able to enjoy some of what Australian culture had to offer. Any Aussies in the audience will not be surprised. I watched a lot of Home and Away, which was their popular soap opera. There was McLeod's Daughters, which was a primetime show about people living in the country, the outback. Big fan of Blue Heelers, the police show about rural policing in Australia. And recently, through the wonders of YouTube, I was able to once again watch one of my favorite shows about firefighters in Australia. It was called Fire. Very melodramatic, very much of its time. I guess in the 90s, but an excellent show and worth checking out on YouTube shortly. Of course, we had a little bit in the 80s, a little bit of an Australian boom in America, in that suddenly Australia was on our cultural radar. Now, I've been an AC/DC fan practically all my life, so the Angus Young and the boys have always kind of been at the forefront of our cultural awareness. But then you get Men at Work, their big hit Land Down Under. In the 80s, you get Crocodile Dundee, which is a successful comedy action franchise exposing people to Australia. And of course, my favorite, the Mad Max series of movies. They recently recast, so we got the post-Mel Gibson Mad Max, but of course, I love the original movie, along with The Road Warrior, an absolute classic. And I enjoyed Thunderdome, although by that time it was getting a little worn for me. So I've always been a fan of Australia. I try and keep up a little bit on what's going on down under. Currently, I'm following with interest Australia's response and to China's aggression. And as always, glad to see whenever Australia as a country kind of stands up for itself. People may not recall, but during the Korean War, the Aussies were one of our main allies. And even during World War I, you had the Anzacs Brigade, and the Australians fought bravely at Gallipoli, the failed invasion of the Dardanelles, and really earned the respect of their fellow warriors the world over, based on their bravery and their tenacity on those beaches in Turkey. So nothing but respect for the Aussies. Recently, as in yesterday, I binge-watched a show on Amazon that was called Last One Laughing. So this particular show is comprised of 10 Australian comedians, stand-up comedians for the most part, who would be locked in an apartment basically for 6 hours and eliminated if they laughed. So they would try to make each other laugh, and then those who did, and it wasn't a full-blown laughter, it was literally cracking a smile, was enough to get you tossed off. That, and the prize was 100,000 Australian dollars. It's about 70K US. So a pretty good payday for one day of work. And it was said to feature the best in Australian comedic talent. So it seemed to be tailor-made for me. So imagine my surprise when, and I watched through the entire show. Imagine my surprise to find that I really hadn't laughed once throughout it. You would think that the combination in the U.S., you could think of it as being a situation where you had Dave Chappelle and Bill Burr, Kevin Hart, our top stand-up comedians, Louis C.K., coming together, Christina Pazsitzky, Tom Segura, Anthony Jeselnik, all those folks kind of locked in a room together with orders to make each other laugh and to avoid laughing lest they be eliminated with some money on the line. You'd think that just flat out couldn't miss, right? And as a purveyor of Australian culture to some extent, I figured, well, even if there's differences there, I should be able to enjoy what they offer. After all, I can watch comedies on BritBox and really enjoy them. Heck, my wife and I are working right now through, I've got the old Allo series on DVD. It's one of the funniest stand-up comedy not stand-up comedy, situation comedies ever made. This was on the BBC originally. Hysterically funny. Of course, anyone who's a fan of Simon Pegg and the work that he's done will be familiar with Spaced, which, the much more recent Britcom that's just amazing. So I figured going in that there'd be no question of enjoying my time with the show and kind of laughing throughout, right? Unfortunately, the experience was a little bit less than what I would desire. I won't spoil the show for you by revealing who won it, but it was a rather painful process. A number of the comedians just tried to kind of shock in order to get that initial reaction. So they would, shout out a cuss word or what have you. And sometimes that was sufficient to get another comedian to break and risk elimination from the show. In the structure of the show, they were given these Joker cards, which allowed them to command everyone's attention in the room for a full 3 minutes. So they would hold up the Joker card, say, I'm going to play my Joker card. They had a little stage there, and they would do their thing in front of the little stage there. Now, you have to remember that the comedians didn't come into this cold. Some of them clearly put in a lot of time in preparation. There was one scene where someone had these large, like 11 by 17 photoshopped pictures that clearly took some time and effort to put together beforehand. There were props that were made available to them that they could go off into a side room and get, and that sort of thing. But it was funny that when they played there was no instance where they played the Joker cards. Well, I shouldn't say it. There was one instance where clearly the person had prepared for it, and so they had something that they could offer. In another case, they had pre-written some jokes to have other people read. So that was an example of having some preparation and being able to use good effect. But you have to remember, these people are stand-up comedians, so they work up a routine. And you would think that when they flash the Joker, that they would have a routine. It's 3 minutes. A typical stand-up routine, when they jump up and just do some kind of crowd work, is about 5 minutes. So this was even less than that. You would think that they would have a bit that they'd written for 3 minutes that would appeal to at least some, if not all, of the comedians present. They deliver that bit because that's what they do. And they'd make people laugh. But it never happened. They went up kind of woefully unprepared as a general rule. One person was going to throw up into a glass container, and that was their bit. In the end, they weren't able to do it, so they kind of wasted even that. But that's what they thought was going to make other comedians laugh. They did a lot of just making a mess kind of things, pouring beverages out onto the floor and throwing flour all over themselves. At one point, as you might predict, somebody got a pie in the face. But it was just kind of painfully unfunny for most of the production. And yet, at the time, and this was what I found most fascinating, they would have a totally stone face, and they would say, "Oh, that was real funny. Oh, that was killer. Oh, I'm going to have to get up and move away from you because that's too funny." And so there was this constant, they looked like robots that were observing a comedy routine. And so certainly that's built into the game. You have to try and keep a straight face. But it was interesting that the comedians were put in a position where clearly they were used to people laughing at whatever they did. This wasn't happening. It was unnerving. And so they would try to reassure one another that, no, that's funny. You would see the interstitial commentary where the people back in the room, what would happen is as you were eliminated, you would join the other folks back in the monitoring room and watch everybody. And they were constantly talking. They weren't really laughing much, but they were commenting as to how funny it was. And it was just painfully unfunny. There was one fairly coherent bit where somebody came out and got into a children's swimming pool, and then the other comedians came out and pretended to anoint and bathe them. So it was rather like watching improv on a particularly unscripted night, where they don't have a good, a good way of getting from point A to point Z. Kind of like you would see on a bad episode of Whose Line Is It Anyway, where they're just given something right out of the blocks and they have to try and make something of it. And these guys clearly were just not up to that task. It was particularly bad because by the rules of the game, you could be thrown out if you were passive, meaning if you didn't go on the attack in terms of trying to make somebody laugh, then you'd get warned and you'd eventually get thrown out. And so you would see this frenetic energy. It was as though, try and picture Robin Williams as an actuarial accountant trying to do his routine. When he wanders up through the audience and he has that largely cocaine-fueled energy just riffing, joke every couple of seconds, almost at random, right? And so they were trying to do this, but they didn't have his chops. They didn't have his playfulness. And so it was just kind of exhausting. And I bring all this up just to point out that I think that there's something that's happening in comedy. You can, go on one of these shows and, and drop, some profanity or something. And people now tend to think that that's enough. And they still pretend that that's somehow shocking. In order for people to laugh, there needs to be two things. You need to have surprise and truth. And by that I mean, if there's nothing between the setup and the punchline which surprises you, it's not going to be funny. And if it doesn't reflect some truth, some level of reality, even if it's absurd, then it's not going to be funny either. And I think in comedy today, that what we're seeing is that because Western culture has become so oppressively politically correct, that people are afraid to tell the truth. And that puts comedians in a corner where they overemphasize surprise through shock and hope that carries them for the laugh. A lot of times people will say that, hey, comedians, from the court jesters on, represent an important role in society because they speak truth to power. That mockery, that edge, is true courage in those cases. But I think they're afraid. Cancel culture has them afraid. You'll hear even guys like Jerry Seinfeld, beloved comedian. You'll hear him say he will not work college rooms anymore. Why? Because he doesn't need the hassle of just having them protest because he says something. Now, Jerry Seinfeld is not a very edgy comedian as a general rule. He's an observational comic, though, and sometimes you observe things and comment on things that people don't want to acknowledge exist. And he doesn't want the hassle of having to deal with sponsors canceling and the death threats and all the nonsense that comes from puncturing the bubbles of these precious little college students in their enclosures on campus. Colleges used to be places where people went to have their minds opened, to be exposed to truths from time immemorial, to encounter minds across the vast gulf of eons and wrestle with the great ideas. But that's not the case anymore. They're spoon-fed whatever leftist pablum their tweedy Marxist professors are told to feed them. And there's a sense that they must be protected. They must have safe spaces, lest, God forbid, any contrary idea enter their thick little skulls. And that's carrying over now into the general culture. It's what makes Dave Chappelle so dangerous. Dave Chappelle has somewhat of a protected status for a couple of reasons. One is Dave Chappelle is the funniest stand-up comedian of our generation. He's the best at it. They compare him to Richard Pryor, but in fact, he's Richard Pryor's superior. There's no one who's as consistently funny as Dave Chappelle is. There's no one who can command an audience like he does, period. Not even Richard Pryor in his prime. But Chappelle is also a black man. And so there's still enough residual left from the civil rights era that the hardened, humorless Marxist left in this country will not easily criticize Dave Chappelle because he's a black man. It goes against the grain still. That's changing, sadly, in a lot of ways, but that's the reality. And so Dave Chappelle is a little bit protected. Now, Dave Chappelle is also a rather courageous man. And so he will go right out after the things that make people uncomfortable. There are a few other comics who have that kind of courage. Norm Macdonald is one. Gilbert Gottfried is one. Gilbert Gottfried famously got booted from his gig voicing the Duck on Affleck commercials. That's an American insurance company that uses a duck as a mascot, and they say the name Affleck in the duck voice. So Gottfried had that job, real easy job. Come in and voice the duck for maybe a day and hammer a big check. It was kind of a dream job, right? Well, Gottfried, after the big tsunami that struck Japan, told a rather infamous joke. And what he said was, boy, the Japanese are really advanced people. They're so advanced, they don't go to the beach. The ocean comes to them. And for that joke, he lost his job, lost a lot of his income, and was pretty much exiled, at least for a time, within the entertainment community. But the thing about Gilbert Gottfried is he will make those jokes. He was a fixture on the Comedy Channel roasts for that reason. You get a guy like Norm Macdonald, he's unafraid to make jokes that make people uncomfortable. In fact, he was fired from Saturday Night Live, where he had the Weekend Update, the fake newscast gig that he absolutely loved and excelled at. But he was fired during the height of the O.J. Simpson trial because Don Ohlmeyer, exec at NBC, was a buddy of O.J. Simpson. And he told Norm Macdonald to stop making fun of O.J. Simpson. And of course, this led Norm Macdonald to make more fun of O.J. Simpson. And in some episodes of the Weekend Update, to do a number of callbacks to his earlier Simpson jokes, such that most of the skit was at O.J. Simpson's expense. Got him fired for that. So there are a few out there who are still fulfilling that role of court jester in our society, still willing to point out the foibles and the hypocrisies of our would-be rulers, but not many. And I think we're seeing that in Australia as well, based on what I saw during that show. Is it was a bunch of people who were essentially afraid to really be funny. At one point during the show, someone comes out dressed in drag, wearing a schoolgirl's uniform, such as you would see on my favorite Australian soap opera, Home and Away. He had on a red fright wig. He walked like a linebacker. And there was a number of really fake bad teeth in the room. And he missed the obvious joke. If he had put those bad teeth in his mouth and started singing I Touch Myself by the Divinyls, he would have been a dead ringer for Chrissy Amphlett. The Divinyls were an Australian band. Chrissy Amphlett was really the first lady of Australian rock and roll. I love Chrissy Amphlett. She had, at least for most of her career, really horrible teeth. And she would wear that home and away schoolgirl outfit while stalking the stage like a linebacker. So if he had gone up and done Chrissy Amphlett, I guarantee you at least a couple of those people would have cracked a smile and been out of there. So why didn't he? I think he was afraid to. Now, they could make jokes about pedophile priests, and they could make jokes about wanton women. They could make jokes about various things being defecated. That was all well and good. But when you start picking on celebrities who have fairly recently passed away, oh, that's a little too dangerous. Can't do that. Especially if they were feminist icons. Can't do that. Even if it would have shocked and surprised, even if there was a lot of truth to it, and even if it would have gotten a laugh. Sad commentary on the state of comedy, not just in Australia, but I think pretty much globally. We'll know that freedom has returned vibrantly once we see our comics once again free to really make us laugh, to touch on the subjects that make us uncomfortable, to mock those who believe themselves to be above mockery. That's when we'll know that the vitality has been restored to our culture. In terms of things we value in these kind of dark times, what could be valued more highly than a good laugh? There was a book that was out a few years back. It was a compilation of road stories of traveling comics. Absolutely hysterical. I believe the name of the book was I Killed. Can't remember who it was by. But there's one story in there in particular that stuck with me, and it is so just typical of the time we're in and that the mood we're in as a country and as a civilization that I share it with you here. The comedian was Larry Miller. Many of you will recognize him from, say, the Christopher Guest series of mockumentaries. Absolutely fabulous comedian. And Larry, who looks kind of like a door-to-door insurance salesman, was going on about the time that he was asked to do his stand-up routine for firefighters. So this was post 9/11. And he, like the rest of us, had a tremendous respect for first responders. He was like, agreed to do it in a heartbeat. He's like, what could be better than making a bunch of firefighters laugh? So as he gets to the venue, he realizes that the occasion is actually a memorial for a firefighter who had died, or actually I think it was two firefighters who had died battling a blaze the previous day. So they have the pictures of the firefighters up. Everyone's just dissolved in tears. They're playing the songs, showing the slideshows of all their pictures. Everyone is just weeping into their kerchiefs. And right at the tail end of it, the MC stands up and says, "He's here to make you laugh. Let's welcome Larry Miller." That is what it feels like. And I'm sure to be a citizen in these days, I'm sure that is how many of these comedians feel as they attempt to ply their craft while the various commissars are out there sitting in the audience, the Karens who are just looking for who to scold, who are just waiting to speak to their manager. These are the times that we live in. Be well, my friends.